Welcome back to Covenant Matters. I'm your host, Josh, and I'm joined today by George, John, and James for the first time, and whoever George is holding up on his camera. But guys, thank you so much for joining me. James, this is your first time joining us, right? On a round
That
table at
is.
least?
That's right. First time roundtable. Glad to be
So
here.
we're here just shamelessly riding James's coattails. James has his book out, which, by the way, okay, so this is kind of a funny story to start off. I was going to hold up your book right here,
Mhm.
and if you've got it, feel free to. It'd be King of Kings. It's out through Founders Press. Excellent book. We'll list it in the show notes and all that. Hang on, James is retrieving. There it is. So
Look
this
at
is the
that.
one making waves. A lot of great engagement on this. Really, really thankful to see a lot of guys reaching out and engaging it. I'm even more so looking forward to your rebuttals to some of their negative engagements for those who did give negative engagement because I think the book's a slam dunk. However,
Thanks, man.
I don't have it with me because it's in my hunting bag. Because my
Oh, nice.
idea was during archery season to be reading King of Kings and bow hunting on the
Uh-huh.
side. It did not work well. Um, but the book's good. So anyway, today though,
Thanks.
yeah, today we're not talking about your book though, so don't get excited. We're talking about can Protestants
Not if
work
I have
with,
anything to do with it.
you say what now?
Said not if I have anything to do with it.
Yeah. This is tangentially related. Can Protestants work with Rome? This is our topic du jour. It's Reformation week. I'm wholly uninterested. WHOLLY. Wholly uninterested with a debate about whether or not churches should celebrate Reformation Day or Reformation Week. You know everybody can come to their own conclusions. However, it is Reformation Day, at least broadly celebrated, and it's a good time that Protestants always we kind of tend to revisit this every so often. To what extent can Protestants and the Roman Catholic Church have any sort of meaningful relationship or interworkings or common ground? I have if I'd thought about it, I would have grabbed it off my shelf. I have R.C. Sproul's kind of seminal, or not seminal, but his very influential book of "Are We Together?" Written on Roman Catholicism, which I thought was a really helpful and warm and pastoral book. But I've talked long enough, and we've already lost George. Guys, what do you guys think about can Protestants work with Rome? How do we get this thing going?
I'll start. Yes and no. Similar to any other dynamic we might find ourselves in, there, depending on what we're working together on, right? And so, Francis Schaeffer's notoriously known for the co-belligerency kind of doctrine, where if you're outside protesting an abortion mill, the Catholics want to join. There's no reason why we can't join arms with that, or
Yeah.
political sphere, or all sorts of things that are non-theological in the broader sense, and so there's certainly avenues where we find ourselves in common society, where Catholics and Protestants have shared morals, shared um, virtues that we can work together on for the common good of the land. Uh, Now, even in Protestantism, you have limitations on the types of people you're going to join with as your ministry becomes more specific. And so that would be really pointed when it comes to Catholics and Protestants in terms of, uh, there was I think it was called Evangelicals and Catholics Together or something a while back. Uh, that's just ecumenical movement that really just downplays any sort of distinctions, any sort of foundational understanding of the gospel. And so when it comes down to those types of issues, we're not going to have a joint worship service with the Catholic Church because they're going to be focused on the Eucharist and the Mass, and we see that as being idolatry.
Can I
And
point out
so,
one thing, by the way, John, as
yeah.
you're talking about this? So I think, like in the background of this, and then I want to let James and George speak too. But like in the background of this, I think one of the things that's interesting. So when we have, you mentioned like a joint service. We just had a joint service. We invited a lot of NAPARC churches in the area, and it was good. And we saw a lot of brethren that we don't usually see on a Sunday evening service in this case. But in any case, when you're talking about Roman Catholics and Protestants, can Protestants work with Rome was the kind of title question. My mind always goes to like the mainline churches. So I rarely hear this question, although we have significant divergences with many of the mainline churches that we should, in theory at least, we in theory espouse the same confessional standards. Again, I can't stress in theory enough, but still, you typically don't have those conversations when it comes to mainline churches because mainline churches are so divergent from where most Protestants are with social, ethical, all sorts of issues that we actually see. Again, not always, but in a lot of cases, Protestants will see more common ground with Roman Catholics in those areas of society and ethics and related conversations than they do with the mainline Protestant denominations, which I think is a fascinating kind of divergence of those things. But again, I jumped in. You guys helped me start filling this question in. Not everybody at once.
George, we got to go order some.
George, can we? You've got the shirt on,
That's
boldly
right.
declaring our Protestant faith. Can we work with Rome? To what extent can we work with Rome?
No, I don't think we can work with Rome, but I think we can co-labor with Catholics, and I might be the moderate in this group. I mean, I understand our heritage is, I mean, there's no gray between our heritage and the Reformation, the Scottish Presbyterians, the Westminster Standards, and Rome because of what Rome was back then. Rome's a different Rome right now, but the theology is the same. But like I see much more sort of works-based righteousness coming out of many Baptist churches and maybe some within NAPARC, but than I actually do in an average Catholic church. And I know a lot of Catholics I think are saved and are just confused about things. So like individual Catholics, I don't have a problem with locking arms.
Are you talking about Roman Catholics, George? I was
Yeah,
confused because you're letting them steal our word, but go ahead. Yeah, Roman Catholics. Sorry.
they
That was
would.
a Nicene Creed joke, by the way. The one Holy Catholic and Apostolic
Yeah,
Church. That was
I know. Well, it's
let it
on here
just let
somewhere.
it slide. I'm sorry. Continue, brother.
Yeah, I don't even know where my train of thought was. In
I do.
general, I'm not going to compromise the theology and our view of justification and salvation, but
Yeah.
I personally know, and maybe I'm the only former Catholic on this in this group, so I have a lot of family and oh no, okay, well, and there are a number of Catholics that I firmly believe are saved because we're not saved based on our right view of salvation. We're saved based on faith in Christ.
Mhm.
And many Catholics are just they're not savvy in their theology. But many of them I know would never say they'd get to heaven and say, "Yeah, I was a good person."
And one of the things I really appreciated you saying was like you drew a distinction between can we work with Roman Catholics or can we work with Rome? And I think that's a really important distinction in addition to what John had already pointed out. But I think it's a really important distinction because I remember vividly I had a series of meetings with he was a professor, undergraduate professor at a Roman Catholic school, and he and I had a series of meetings over the course of a year or so, and we'd meet in a coffee shop and debate some of these things. And as a teacher, I had to remind him that Trent was still in force. And so, we were talking through some of the church councils and everything like that, and he was describing the conciliatory nature that they have toward their, terms such as like, lost and confused Protestant cousins, that we are just a confused type. We're not in hard recalcitrant rejection of Rome's teachings, therefore that they kind of see us in the same boat. And I had to remind him that, no, Trent is still dogma for the Roman Catholic Church. This is still part of their teachings that it holds that those who profess the five solas of the Reformation are to be anathema, and that I am in the side of Rome, I am damned. However, in the side of this Roman Catholic, even a Roman Catholic teacher, I was just a confused cousin who he counted as a brother. So important distinction, I think, to draw out there.
Yeah, yeah, I do think it's interesting what you brought up early on about mainline churches and the like. There is a difference because, and this is what confuses maybe Protestants because obviously like Catholics, true Catholics, Roman Catholics, for your to use the language you want me to use, they would proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord. They believe in the Trinity. They believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. Uh, and so like the mainline churches don't believe those things. And that's why I think like we feel a kinship maybe with some conservative Catholics, but we got to remember that they don't share our view of justification by faith alone, which is the doctrine that the church stands or falls on. And so, I think sometimes Catholics are viewed as like, to what John said about, the useful co-belligerents, maybe in some of these Christian nationalist movements, it's like they're viewed as allies. I just interviewed and had on my podcast Aldo Leon, which like in his Christian nationalism, there would be no recognition of Roman Catholicism and their churches would be gone. And so like you just have this divergence because if we want to go back to our heritage, we have to have immense hostility toward them. But I don't think it's the same situation right now. And so, like I said, I'm a little more moderate on it, but never sacrificing understanding of justification and our doctrines, and of course, all the Mariology and all their
Sure.
sacramentology, all that's a mess. And
Yeah. And I mean, and just to point out the elephant in the room, recent, how can I say this very nicely? Recent popes and recent Roman Catholic divergence from their historical positions has not made this conversation easier. We were talking earlier about the current pope laying hands on a block of ice. Like there's a lot of things going on now that just kind of make this conversation even more complicated. But James, any thoughts on this one before we get into some of the more meat of the matter?
Yeah, I think one thing I would affirm a lot of what John and George just said. The thing I think I would want to emphasize is um, the we got to keep in mind that working with Catholics is different than working with someone as part of the mainline church in one very important respect. And that is that a Catholic has pledged fealty to the Pope. That's really what it means to be Catholic, right? So there's that doesn't happen in a mainline church, right? That's not really how those organizations work. And so when you're choosing what to work with a Catholic on, like, do we want to collaborate on this particular project? Keep in mind not merely, hey, we can work on the stuff that we agree with. You also have to keep in mind the power dynamics. Because even if this particular Catholic, let's say, is a bit hapless, you're still ingrained, you're giving opportunity and power to a global organization by giving them opportunities to be influential. So I think we can't lose sight of the structure of the organization. I want to, have as a generous spirit towards as many people as possible. In fact, in a very important moment in my life, it was a Catholic family who kind of saved me, really, from just a terrible situation. I went and lived with them for a few months. So I have some dear Catholic friends. A lot of former Catholics come to our church, a lot of them. But I still think don't only keep in mind kind of doctrinal differences, but the power dynamics in view as well, because that's dangerous. And in many ways, that's part of what sparked the Reformation. I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. So
Yeah.
that's the only thing I would add is remember that this person has pledged fealty to a foreign power that claims universal jurisdiction over your faith.
Yeah.
It's
That's
not just someone who's kind of differs with you doctrinally.
yeah, but James, like
Mhm.
that's like a de facto thing, right? I mean, I was a baptized Catholic. I
Yep.
never I never proclaimed fealty to the Pope.
I mean,
I mean, until I
absolutely.
was in my mid to upper 20s, I was
When were
uh
you confirmed?
I was confirmed at baptism because I'm from the Eastern Rite of the Catholic
Oh, okay.
Church.
Oh, okay.
They do everything. I even did
Okay.
paedo communion, which I'm against. But my point
Yep.
is very much like Orthodoxy because I'm from the Middle East.
hmm
But okay, so your argument would be through confirmation,
Yeah,
that's the moment. Okay.
for sure. For sure. If you're, what does it mean to say you're Catholic? What it means to say that you're a Roman Catholic is that you follow and obey the Pope, right?
correct. Hey, James, correct me if I'm wrong here. This is part of our CIA, correct? So Roman Catholic initiation of adults includes is similar to in the PCA, for example, we're all PCA guys. You would pledge to study the peace and purity of the church. Within RCIA, you would pledge to submit to the Pope,
hmm hmm
correct?
Yep. Yep. That's right. So, sure, yeah, you have, and again, like you need to treat individuals as individuals, right? I'm granting that. But let's say you're working with someone and they become super influential in your local pro-life organization, let's say, right? And they're very influential and you've worked together. And then because they have strong representation there, it attracts more and more Catholics, more and more Catholics, more and more Catholics, more and more Catholics, to where now you have a situation where that whole movement is being dominated by a group of Catholics who pledge fealty to the Pope, right? Then, and the Pope changes his mind. Keep that in mind. That happens frequently now these days. I'm not saying that that's like impermissible. I'm just saying that is a cost to weigh as well, um, in addition to doctrinal differences.
And I'm
So
glad you're
even
bringing up
when,
pro. Sorry, go ahead,
but
James.
I was going to say, even when you agree on a particular doctrinal point, the structures between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism are so different. You can get, and part of this is why Catholics have so much power in Washington now. Why is that? It's because why is the vice president, Catholic, and pretty much no one has any problems with that. I'm going to make a case on why J.D. Vance is Protestant later on, but right now I'm going to call him a Roman Catholic, right? It's because we have worked with Catholics for so long and they've taken advantage of that opportunity, right? And we could lose something very important to us if we're not careful.
And
Right.
so often with the pro-life type movements, like
Yeah.
you mentioned. So, pro-life was probably if you're thinking of can Protestants work with Rome, that's probably where most Christians' minds would go to for a
Yeah.
good reason, right? Like within
Very good
pro-life
reason.
industry. You can see this at places, for example, Hillsdale. We ministered down the road. I say down the road, it was an hour down the road from Hillsdale, for
It's way
several
down the
years.
road.
But I'm sorry.
It's way down the road.
If you've been to that area of Michigan, it's not there's not a whole lot. Like you could say that's down the road. There's nothing in between the two. But in any case, Hillsdale famously having kind of a Protestant Catholic and really a trad Catholic movement. Interestingly, from if you talk to many of those on campus, the trad Cath movement at Hillsdale, for example, mostly driven not by doctrinal convictions or any fealty to Rome, at least in principle or in their thought process, but it's mainly a fealty toward traditional conservative ethical and
Right.
social values, like I mentioned at the outset. This is more of a retrieval of societal norms movement than it is a Roman Catholic per se, doctrinal movement. But
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, think about this. Let's say J.D. Vance becomes the next president, which I hope he does, because it's our best option, right? Technically, what that means is that the Pope in Rome has the authority to tell the President of the United States what his civil policy should be. That's
which
that's
is which is the
technically
same
true.
the same concern when JFK ran,
The same
right?
concern with JFK. Now, America is a Protestant enough nation that we would absolutely lose our minds, and so that's not really practical for J.D. Vance, right? But, the frog gets boiled slowly. So
Hmm.
just weigh that in your mind.
Well, Biden claimed to be a Catholic, and that would have held under him and Francis. So
Yep.
So I'm just maybe it's a turn a little bit. I'll say that all of our conversation right now has been really soft compared to, the guys who wrote these books,
Yeah, that's fair.
right? They did not hold back. I mean, I
This
remember
is
the
why
first,
this is why Calvin's commentaries are the best.
Mhm.
Calvin's commentaries are here's the verse, here's my two sentences thought, and here is 18 sentences railing against the papacy.
yes, yeah. See, we haven't even
Just
said papist yet, right? Like
Mhm.
that was like the go-to vernacular. I remember the first time I read Brockle writing a paper for my ordination, and I was like, oh man, this guy really doesn't like Catholics.
Mhm.
Which, but I mean, that's a moment in time, and I think so. Anyways, we have found ourselves in this modern age where everything's been softened down, and even on the other side, right? I think
Right.
there's discourse about whether Roman Catholicism's baptisms are valid in our churches and those things, and people differ on that question. But sometimes when I think about that question, I think, well, is it the Catholic Church at Trent, which is what the reformers and post-Reformation writers are really kind of engaged in? But we're like post-Vatican II, which in many ways
Yeah.
adopts a lot of Protestantism into Catholicism in terms of their worship and even their view of Protestants. And so it's a
Unless
moving
you're Mel
target.
Gibson.
Yeah, yeah, it's a moving target for everybody at all times. And
This is a
George mentions Aldo, like we're just going to deport all the Catholics. Like that's what they would have said, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
there's no room.
Yeah, but that's why at the beginning I say I acknowledge that very thing. We're not living in a world where the Catholic Church is running the world. The Catholic Church actually,
Yep.
it exerts an influence, but not any real power. I mean, yeah, and really their message now is in their churches, most of their churches is, they're very accepting of a lot of social liberal kind of policies, even if the official positions of the church are strong on ethics and stuff. They're not forcing their members to do anything. Their membership can do whatever they want. They don't even bar people from communion anymore. So it's a different animal. That's why I said, like, I understand their doctrines are the same, but in practice, it's not the same
Some do
thing.
some do bar from communion, right? That came up with Clinton when Clinton was still in, quite famously, right?
Yeah, but it's not upheld at the highest levels.
At the highest, true.
It really just depends on which priest wants to do what and which bishop. I was actually just this last week talking to a priest about this, and I said, well, how many bishops are there? And he didn't even know. And I said, well, who do they report to? Because we have this idea that everybody reports. He says, well, to the Pope. I'm like, well, how is the Pope exercising authority over 5,000 bishops? If there's a rogue bishop, how? And he just didn't even have an answer for it, because that's what you see. You see some bishops and dioceses are very progressive, very liberal, very against the teachings of the Catholic Church. And so to me, Catholicism looks very much that whenever a Catholic argues with me about the sort of the disparate views in Protestantism, I say, why, you think you have anything different in your church? You have Catholics promoting abortion, even though the official stance of the church is against abortion. You have gay Catholic priests, even though you affirm that that's a sin.
Well, I think that's what makes a lot of this conversation so hard is like for Americans, we're essentially talking, can American Protestants work with American Rome? Like that's our context, right? And that's what we're kind of talking about. And for a lot of us, I've visited Roman Catholic churches here that are Protestant through and through, just like you were just saying, George. I've also been to South America and walked into churches that literally, when I say they're Marianist, like
Oh yeah.
there are no crosses. There are no depictions of Christ, although I'm not for a depiction of Christ either. But Mary is in the front. Mary is who is prayed to. It's named at, like, it is so clearly a Mary. It's a worship of Mary, like in every form and function that you can describe it, in
All
a way
through
that
their
would be
village.
so foreign and offensive to many American
Yeah,
Catholics.
shrines in every home. Like, yeah, I was in like the Yucatan of Mexico on multiple mission trips, and everywhere you went, there were shrines and candles of Mary, not just in the churches.
Right.
So clearly idolatrous practices in certain spots. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this might be related to the question of the Reformation being political, but I think the crux of what we're talking about is just the nature of egalitarianism in the world now. The Pope is impotent. He's impotent. He has no real authority, right? Bishops are rogue. Like, whereas before, he'd have been cracking skulls and burning bodies, right? He was a dangerous man, right? You would not, if you were a rogue bishop or a rogue priest, that was a big deal. And in the same way, even in the American context, the Protestants, we don't have any authority. We don't have a Protestant prince, or whatever, all these different things that are happening at the time of the Reformation. And so we're all just like neutered voices. And how do we get along as people who don't? And I think that's part of the impulse to collaborate on certain things is, hey, none of us really have the power that once was in the world. And really, there is no one person that has that type of reign and rule in a sole way anymore. And so it's all very kind of pushed down, egalitarian, democratic. Power structures, authority has kind of gone away. I mean, even the president of the United States, you could say whatever you want to him on Twitter, and he might actually see it. And you can make a meme about, JD Vance and make his face look like a little kid or whatever. And it's funny, actually, and he gets into it. But that is a power dynamic that is crazy. That shows the flattening of what was once a very strong authority that has gone away from. And that's definitely pointed in Rome. I mean, I think I mean, same thing. You have Catholics themselves publicly, criticizing the Pope on social media. Uh, you know, are they allowed to do that? What Nobody even really thinks about that. It's more just we're all individuals and we all can say whatever we want, and really nobody has full authority to adjudicate these types of things.
So I think this is kind of my point. The one I was trying to make earlier is why do we feel like it's so easy to collaborate with Catholics now? I mean, in many ways, we have to think about reasons not to collaborate with them, you know? The reason is because of this like post-war weakening and softening of any dogmatic center in society, whether it's philosophy or ethics, especially religion. And Rusty Reno is super great on this in Return of the Strong Gods. He talks about how the 20th century was all about how to avoid the sort of dogmatism that led to the early 20th century conflicts, the two world wars. And Vatican II is the Catholic Church having to adapt itself to the fact that Western society does not want religious authority at all. They see it as evil and wicked and will lead to huge problems, religious wars and such. So the Catholic Church has to adapt with Vatican II, and it's adapting to something that is unnatural to it.
Mm.
Like the Catholic Church that we see today is unnatural. This is not how it naturally works at all. And we've pushed it down successfully for maybe like 70 years. And the whole Western world has suppressed it and forced it to lose its authority. But the one thing that we see in society today with my generation and the one younger than me is wanting to return to these strong gods, return to authority, to tradition, to religion mattering in the public square. And so if you collaborate with Catholics because you're assuming that the post-war consensus of weak gods is going to continue and we really don't have any authority, you know, we can just work together, that's going to turn around and bite you. Because as soon as you are successful together and religion actually matters in the public square and is actually authoritative, all of a sudden you've given power to someone who's sworn fealty to the Bishop of Rome. And I don't want to end up in that situation in 20 years. So I would just say be really, really careful because the Catholics you work with today will not be the Catholics that are in power when their successors rise up. They're going to be the young Catholics who want to go back to unum sanctum, who want to go back to the Pope actually does get to tell the king what to do. That's integralism, basically, right? Stronger forms of integralism. So that's why I'm saying we are leaving the post-war consensus where no one really has any power. So if you agree on something, work together. There's not really a struggle involved, and we're leaving that. That's going to be gone one way or another. It's we're just evolving past it, and that's why I'm like, yes, work with Catholics. I think when you can, if you can, but that is not a costless decision. It's a costly one, as
You
you
know,
look at.
you know, one thing I don't think I've seen anybody pair these two together, but I was in, we can't engage this actually now that I'm even saying it because this will derail us significantly. But just thinking toward critical theory, I was in a school out west that was kind of at the forefront, or I say forefront. They were on the cutting edge of critical theory back before it was a thing. So this would have been like '05, and when critical theory came in, one of the huge, you mentioned power dynamics. One of the huge things with critical theory is obviously that power cannot be shared. It has to be there's always a dominating party. Like there's always a power differential. So the best one can do as an oppressed class is not to gain equal ground. It's ultimately to exert authority over that previously dominating or domineering class. The whole thing with critical theory is it never bought into the post-war consensus you're talking about. So in many ways, I think the strong gods that Reno talks about, this conception of actual power dynamics, it never really went away. It just kind of went on the fringes, and it kind of wore different hats. Critical theory is a strange hat for something to wear, but it exemplifies the fact that the talking points that so many elites were espousing back in those days, think like the late 2000s, those talking points were always a veneer. They never were actually looking for any sort of shared consensus based on weak values. There was always the underlying current of no, there actually has to be a dominating belief in something, whether it exemplifies in something like BLM riots or whether it's something else. But there's always that adherence to to an identity that then exerts itself in a power dynamic over something else. Which, by the way, that don't confuse that for me advocating for critical theory. I'm just saying it exemplifies that those
It's
dynamics
left
are
wing.
really,
It's a left wing strong God,
yeah.
right? Like think about one of my favorite examples is, on the left, what is the chant with Trayvon Martin? Black Lives Matter, right? That's a weak God. Now, I'm not saying that's bad, that's a weak God, right? All that you're saying is like, hey, we want you to care about Black lives. They matter. Okay. Well, George Floyd, what's the phrase? No justice, no peace. That's a strong God, right? That's calling for violent action. There will be chaos until we get what we perceive to be justice, right? So a big shift happens in like, what, 7 years,
Hmm.
8 years? A huge shift. You go from like Black Lives Matter, treat them well, right? Treat them fairly, to no justice, no peace. I think that we, especially in America, especially the 21st century, we can totally underestimate how quickly things change. The other example is the uh, the homosexual agenda, right? So gay marriage is legalized, and the response to the conservatives with that is like, come on, guys, like we're just letting them get married. What's the worst thing that could happen? And the conservatives are flipping out, and they're like, next thing you know, you're going to say that men can turn into women, and it's like, pfft, that's who would think you're just like, all right, what do you get, like 5, 6, 7 years later, right? Now men can compete in women's sports, and you have to respect their pronouns. I mean, that is just a massive societal shift in just a few years. And I don't want to jump out of the frying pan into the fire
Yeah.
with Roman Catholicism, because the one thing the left really doesn't have is a formal power structure. It's like a stochastic network of power, which is very dangerous in some ways because there's no head on the snake, right? But the thing is that when an actual hierarchy of power gets into power, it can do a lot more damage a lot faster because it actually it has not just soft power, it has hard power, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying,
Let's use
weigh
that.
that.
Let's use that caution, and let's try to move into this is kind of like if this is a three-part episode, this will be kind of like part two of it. But thinking toward Semper Reformanda and whether or not we're still protesting. Which, by the way, if anybody's watching on YouTube, I'm not trying to do that thing that the kids are doing now. I was just told this is a no, it's not that. It's you click your fingers
I
together.
don't know what I'm doing, so I'm not going to do it.
I'm very hip. It means that you're saying a good point.
Oh, it's like a clap.
Well,
I've wasted airspace for like 20 seconds now. Nobody
James
cares.
James
Nobody's
did
looking at my
this
hands.
earlier, so that's way more,
Here's
Gen
where
Z.
I'm going. Which by
I'm embarrassed for you, bro.
For me?
brother, I went on
What
a
I
mission
do?
trip to
No,
South
for Josh.
America, and
Oh.
they
I'm
asked me
kidding.
how I
I'm
was
kidding.
doing, and I said I'm doing great. And if you've ever been to Peru specifically, this does not mean I'm doing great, and it's actually horrifying. And I almost got run out of the pastor's council. The point is, um, reeling this thing back in. Semper Reformanda is a pretty popular impetus and term and slogan, right? For especially for Reformed people, that the church is always reforming. So just to give a little background on this, Semper Reformanda is sort of the latter half of a Latin phrase that essentially gets to the Reformed church always reforming, which was not something you're going to find in the writings of Calvin or of Luther necessarily. This comes sort of after the fact of the Reformation, but it's kind of, anachronistically, maybe even kind of attributed back to the Reformation as one of those slogans from it. It actually, interesting to me, it came from the Dutch Reformed piety
Yeah,
movements that
that's
came in
what
the
I thought.
17th century, which we might be able to make some hay there. But it was emphasizing this ongoing moral and spiritual renewal within the church, that we are always reforming in some sense. I'm torn on this one because I both love it and hate it. I think there's ways in which it's tremendously beneficial. I also think there's ways in which it can be tremendously dangerous. George, you and I were corresponding a little bit about this just in brief, but let's discuss Semper Reformanda. Is this a good idea? Are we still protesting as Protestants? What does that look like, and how do we walk into that? And how does this help us, by the way, with the whole focal issue of can we work with Rome? How does this help us think through that?
Yeah, I think it goes to definitions. So you get a slogan, and the slogans can take on their own meaning, and people can apply them rightly or wrongly. So, Reformed Baptists would say, Bap, becoming Credo Baptist was continuing to reform, right? These guys didn't know anything about that. They were still beholden to Roman Catholicism, something like that, right? Uh, and so, at least my argument would be Semper Reformanda is continuing to go back to the scriptures and to the faith that was once delivered to the saints, and all of the reformers, post-Reformation writers, they're engaging with the early church fathers, that the faith that's been handed down. And so, if that's what we mean by it, then yes, we have to continually fight against the spirit of the age and excesses and failures of the church, and be more reformed back to the scriptures and back to the true faith. The idea that continuing to reform is a progressive thing, that, we're going to become, yeah, more catechized by the spirit of the age. We're going to have lady pastors. We're going to have, those types of things. That's how you get the
Shepherdesses.
perversion. Yeah, the perversion of it is, oh, we haven't arrived yet. And I think that's the difference. Is it's not that we haven't arrived; it's that we're continually going back. And so it's more of a directional thing. Are we?
John, John, can
Go
I
ahead.
add in, by the way? So what I'm hearing when you're describing that progression, like sense of it, that improper like progression of it, I'm hearing humanism in that. So this would be like that humanistic impulse of like we are so much better, so much smarter, so much more advanced. We are just like every successive generation, we're just really getting better. Therefore, we are always reforming because the people that came before us are a lot dumber and a lot more antiquated and just they're not where we are. That's what I hear with
Yeah,
that impetus. But
yeah, but in reality, they're, especially at the time of the Reformation, they're much smarter than we were.
often much
Um,
more smart and much more pious and holy and yeah, yeah.
but so I think about even our own denomination. We have three kind of slogans: faithful to the scriptures, true to the Reformed faith, obedient to the Great Commission. So the Great Commission one is kind of benign in the sense that it's just a missions, we're going to do missions. But the first two are actually calls to this exact thing, being faithful to the scriptures. So, our denomination's always kind of shifting and changing, and people are trying to put forward different, overtures and, whatever's happening. But that call is to look back, to come back to the foundations, the scriptures primarily, but also our inherited tradition, our confession of faith. And so that's not adding something new to our denomination's identity, but it is a call to perpetual engagement in this type of semper reformanda, right? That if we're gonna hold to the scriptures, well, now we can have a BCO, but what do the scriptures say, right? And we can come up with, innovations for innovation's usually bad, by the way. But okay, well, what's the Reformed tradition? How have they understood these things? Because they were the, forefathers who were going back to the scriptures, going back to the early practices, and watching through these things, that we're inheritors of that stream. And so yeah, I think it's helpful as long as it's in its proper context. But if it's just used as kind of an excuse to have innovations, an excuse to, like you said, kind of move down the humanist mindset, then yeah, it has all sorts of
And
landmines.
and I'll pass off to James and George here, but like just to give a real practical, I think lay level example of what I think you're getting at, John, is one of the things we've always tried to champion is just the creeds of the church. So we say the creeds in our church. I'm not like mandating that every church has to, but I think in general it's good to, if you don't have the creeds in your worship service in your liturgy, that you at least endorse them and your people are familiar with them and you confess them whenever you can, Sunday night service or Wednesday night or whatever that looks like. But the creeds, by definition, are often unfamiliar to modern Christians. And so a sense of Semper Reformanda, that kind of looking back tethering, is just to say we should have never actually left the Nicene Creed, for example, behind, and it's good for us to retrieve it and to encourage it within our congregation. That would be Semper Reformanda, but it's not like a forward-looking thing. This is actually a very, very old thing that we're trying to look back to and retrieve. But James, George, help me out here.
Well, when progressives tried to justify their progress by Semper Reformanda. I mean, to reform means to go back, and to progress means to go forward, and that's just in the prefixes re versus pro. And so it's self-defeating. We do need to always be reforming, just as Christians need to always be repenting. And so you never arrive. So there's always something else to conform and reform back to the Word of God. And I really just very practically, as pastors, you guys are pastors at churches. I no longer am a pastor over a church, but I just did this work in a church, and there's a real sense of identity crisis among a congregation or a people that are told they've been doing something deviantly or wrong,
Hmm.
and we need to conform to the Word of God, to reform. And the reason for that is because it calls into question their whole faith experience. It in a lot of cases, the Lord is blessing so many things, and so how could He be upset about this one? And when I look at the Word of God, the prophets, at every point in redemptive history, at every point in the Bible, there's a reforming figure coming along. You know, I mean, certainly you think of, the judges, you think of Elijah, the prophets during the time of the kings, you think of John the Baptist in Israel. And the example I used our congregation, because we had a 7-foot stained glass Jesus in our narthex. And I talk about Catholics. I thought I was walking in a Catholic church, because that's what we had, especially in Eastern Catholicism, all kinds of mosaics and things that you light candles to and pray. And then here I walk in a Protestant church, and that's the first thing I see. And there's flowers around it, and it's like a shrine. And I was brought in as executive pastor to help straighten things out, you know, and that was late on the list, honestly, because there was just a lot of things, and you can't fight battles on every front. And but within the congregation, there started to be, and among some officers, some rallying around this issue and a second commandment violation. And as we worked through it, what I realized is we were in a building that's new to us, 25 years now, but this church is an 80-year-old church. And there was a great reformational heritage in that church to pull out of the PCUS, to come into the RPCES first and then the PCA over Reformed principles, but that thing was in their church. So baptisms, funerals, weddings, there's pictures of these significant events in multi-generational. I have 4 generations in this church, and multiple families all worshiping together. That is in their homes. And the Lord had blessed this community for 80 years. And so this idea that, well, what do you mean we need to remove this thing that the Lord has been blessing us all along? And one thing I pointed to was Israel worshiping on the high places in the Bible, because we think that's to the Baals and Ashtoreths. And certainly there was a lot of that, and that's more the predominant thing. But there's multiple places in the Old Testament that say they worshiped Yahweh there. And then you have these figures tearing them down. And I can just picture how they could say, how could you tear down the place where our father and grandfather and great grandfather worshiped Yahweh on our little family worship place? And the point is, they had to. And so this is a long sort of little lecture on, yeah, we are always called to be reforming, but we have to remember as we do this, we need to be working with people to help them see that, because there's a personal connection to a lot of what they've been doing and they didn't realize it.
It's funny as you're talking about that, I'm thinking of, well, I mean, Matt Overhard, up in Ascension Press, he just wrote a book called Worshiptainment, and obviously worship is always the musical, especially part of our worship is always kind of a flashpoint. But that was one of the things he was getting at with kind of a lay level addressment of the regulative principle, is like, is it good for us to do certain things that, like you just described, George, may take some time and there's some emotional attachment to them, but at the same time, like, are these things good and are they biblical? But James, I saw you keying up. What'd you have?
I think that, man, that was an amazing story, George. First of all, learned so
Yeah.
much from that. I think the question for me is, what are we reforming? Are we reforming our church today? Or are we reforming the Reformation? Because I think sometimes that's what people use the phrase to mean. You know, we need to, well, always reforming means all the reformers got this wrong and now we've got it right. I don't believe in that,
Yeah.
frankly. I'm a confessional Presbyterian. Now, are we now, the other good way to use it is, or do we look at our church today and it has now been malformed for whatever reason and we want to reform it? I'm for that because proper reformation of the church today will look like recovery in so many ways, going back to the Reformation and what it got right. And, the book that I wrote, in many ways, it's me saying, always reforming. Our political theology has been malformed for decades now, and we need to reform it by going back to the early American Presbyterians, to Calvin, to Owen, to Turretin. So, big fan of always reforming as long as we are reforming the right thing.
Yeah.
The problem is too many people, the impulse, I think, for just the Reformed Church in America across denominations so often is to reform the Reformation when we don't even understand it. I've noticed that the thing that people want to reform the most are usually the things they don't understand.
Well, who
You need,
was it? Who was was it oh, I'm blanking on the source on this, but he said the issue with American Protestants, or no, I think he said the issue with American Christianity was that they have the Reformation, or no, they have Protestantism without the Reformation.
mm,
Was
that's
that
interesting.
Bonhoeffer? I think maybe that said. In any case, yeah, but
Uh,
that's what he was getting at, though, is right along the lines of what you're talking about. Sorry, go ahead, James.
yeah, so I think the best work that can be done are two things. One is the careful pastoral tactics that George described, one. And two is to actually go back and go back to the Reformation, to recover the Reformation, not try and change it.
Which is not to say that the reformers were perfect in every regard, right? Like all of us here would affirm, like the reformers can and did err in various
Yep.
ways, but it's the same way as we look at our confessional documents. Our confessional documents are not holy writ. They're not on par with Scripture. Our confession begins with that acknowledgement in the very first chapter, talking about Scripture, and yet they bear more weight than I do, and they're certainly something that I want to be tethered to and subscriptional to, precisely because I come from that same convictional family of Christians. So
Right.
yeah,
But I
that's
think if you're going, yeah, they definitely didn't get everything right. But when you're going to correct them, remember that you're correcting someone who's smarter and more godly than you are, frankly. So, okay, they're not perfect, but they are smarter than you,
yeah.
and they are more godly than you are. So
When it's that whole
don't
it's
be
that
a don't be a teenager, right?
yeah.
Who's really good at critiquing dad's parenting.
Dad was so stupid right up until I hit 30. And then all
Mm,
of a sudden, all the dumb things he said make a lot of sense to me. Yeah, it's the whole. We have this conversation with those, like especially within evangelical circles, who are very, suspicious of confessions and kind of the whole Reformed gamut. Is that Scripture has this authority, I have this authority. The confessions are here, so they don't have more authority than Scripture, but they have more authority than I do. And I would lump in the Reformers with that as well, right? When I read Calvin, he's not God, nor is he a divinely inspired apostle, but I'm listening to him a lot more than I'm listening to my reflections over the last 10 minutes from reading
right.
that passage, right? Like there's a certain fifth commandment, I think, outworking of this reflection that we can keep in mind.
Yep.
Other thoughts on Semper Reformanda?
I was just going to make a comment that I think will segue into the next part is, we talk about the Reformation. Its its longer title is the Magisterial Reformation, and that has to do with the magistrates.
Mm,
And so, like my little lecture I gave for our Reformation kind of gathering we did was why we aren't Lutherans,
mm.
because it's Reformation Day, Martin Luther, we have all this Luther swag and stuff, but
I
we're
love
not
how
Lutherans. Well,
polemical you went with that, by the way, John. Here's why we're not those guys. Yeah.
yeah, it's great. I posted it today. There's like a picture of Lutherans per capita, and it's
I saw that.
Minnesota's in the center of the blue, and it's surrounded by, we're like landlocked by Lutherans. So
You,
we live in the land of Lutherans. But the point I was trying to make is that, you know, Luther really comes on the scene, and there's this huge political dynamic to the Reformation. I mean, I made a comment that it was equally political as it was theological. It's probably way more political than it was theological in
Mhm.
Luther's day. And you do have some sort of progressive Reformation that's happening where people like Zwingli and Calvin who come on the scene and Bucer, they're actually able to then have over the freedom to be able to synthesize and write doctrines and out and these theologies and all this kind of stuff and practice. What's it look like to be a Protestant country rather than a Catholic country? What does our worship look like? And so you have the Scottish Reformation, all these types of things.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of my point. We like Luther, but really post-Reformation is when the theological work was really done. And that's not to say he didn't contribute to the theological work, but this idea of the Reformation being magisterial and the political dynamic of even goes to what James is saying. There's still a structure in place that existed where it was total domination. It was an empire. The Roman Catholic Church appointed and had to bless all of the magistrates as being, under his rule and reign, and they were accountable to him. And that shift in reforming not just the church, but by necessary consequence, the nation, because they were one and the same. And so we're so far removed from a world where we have real religious political powers that some of that gets lost on us. But I don't know if we want to take that anywhere.
I can do a quick history of that question.
I was about to say, James, you've thought a little bit about this recently.
I've thought a little bit about this. Oh, quick book plug, not mine. There's an awesome book that's going to come out soon by Timon Clyde Klein called Political Protestantism. That it gives an exhaustive history about exactly how the Reformation was first and in many ways foremost a political event. And the reason is, well, the question is this, what makes you Catholic? Right? There are some beliefs that are distinctively Catholic, but what is it? The question isn't just what do Catholics believe or teach. The question is what makes you Catholic? And the answer to that was, does the Bishop of Rome have universal jurisdiction even over civil powers? Because what happens with Luther, right, is he's going to get killed. And then who protects him? The German nobility. And the case of the Catholic Church was you as a prince in Germany, you have no authority to protect him. You certainly have no authority to say this part of Germany is going to be Protestant, not Catholic. It was a jurisdictional question. And the Protestants said they absolutely do because they are the temporal head of their realm, and so they can decide to protect Protestant churches and turn away Catholic churches. They have that civil power. So where this all starts is, of course, you have the early church that's just trying to survive under a persecuting Roman Empire. Then you have the conversion of Constantine, and Constantine legalizes Christianity, right? You can be Christian. He doesn't make the Roman Empire officially Christian. He just legalizes it and favors it, protects the church, builds churches, does things like call councils together, like the Council of Nicaea. Then there's a big shift that happens hundreds of years later with Charles the Great, with Charlemagne, right? He's European and he becomes Holy Roman Emperor. And the Holy Roman Empire is really just Europe. It's not the Roman Empire. But how does he become crowned Holy Roman Emperor? The Pope. The Pope crowns him. And this kicks off a whole bunch of Catholic theology that says all kings gain their legitimate authority through the power of the Pope. And that remains a stable fixture of Catholic theology, at least theoretically, even if they aren't actually able to exert that kind of political power. Theoretically, they have it. And when does that officially change? Napoleon. Because what does Napoleon do? Napoleon doesn't let the Pope crown him, he crowns himself. And then you have really the weakening of the Catholic Church after that. So it's in that context of the power that the Pope is claiming that Protestants rise up and they say, no, the civil magistrate is the one who will actually decide what sort of religion is going to happen inside of this realm, then eventually you get America, where the First Amendment says the president won't make that decision. We'll let the states make those decisions. And then eventually Americans didn't even want the states making those decisions anymore. Now you end up in the morass that we have today.
Hmm.
Um, but that's kind of the story of why the Reformation is a political question.
Bro,
That was a really good, very brief overview.
yes, that was amazing.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's wild to hear, just kind of thinking through the repercussions of what you said there at the end. I think that's one of the reasons why, if you were to think of, our initial question was, can Protestants work with Rome? And you think of a lot of the issues that have at their core, whether they should be political issues or theological issues primarily, that's neither here nor there really. You have issues like abortion, you have issues like all the societal and ethical things that we could name, in which Protestants are trying to sort through. Can we actually partner with Roman Catholics on these issues, or with Rome on these issues? And then you have into that, as you just described, this malaise of most Protestants feeling that not even the state magistrates nor any magistrate should have any duty, as your book has stirred the pot with, any duty to promote good, and good in the biblical sense in which God has revealed what is good, oh man, as opposed to just some societal agreement, or some de facto consensus agreement on what we feel is good, but to actually promote good in and of itself. So it's interesting when you pair those two things, you can see not only how the Reformation was an inherently political movement, but also why we are so struggling with how to even partner with Roman Catholics, because we have kind of untethered ourselves from any sort of political engagement, or even any desire for the magistrate to promote what is good, and for the church to have a vocal piece in exemplifying and clarifying what God has said is good, as we're
Yeah,
called to do.
I think that the fact that J.D. Vance is our best option for the next president is a judgment on Protestants. I mean, we basically forked over the public square
Yeah,
to Catholics. We really did. The most powerful advocacy groups are either Jewish in one way or another, or they're Catholic.
yeah,
They're not Protestant, certainly not Presbyterian,
right,
Orthodox Presbyterian. And now we're kind of having to lay in the bed we made.
yeah,
Go back to the 1900s. Multiple historians have said the General Assembly of the PCUSA was the most powerful body civilly in America, second only to Congress, and even then it's close. Because think about it, what was one of the major institutions that is actually sending politicians into every level of government during that time? It's Princeton University,
right,
which at that time is Orthodox Presbyterians who are running it. In fact, they found Princeton Seminary because they realized Princeton University was too busy building statesmen. So they decided to so they had two institutions. One was run by Presbyterians to train politicians. The other one was run by Presbyterians to train pastors. The 1900s really was, Presbyterian dominance in America. Um, and many Supreme Court presidents, congressmen, senators, and not including even the states. And then we basically give over the main line, right? So that even in the early 20th century, you're still Presbyterian dominant, but they're not Orthodox anymore. It's Woodrow Wilson. And we lose the farm, and now our best option is a Roman Catholic.
hmm,
I would say that's our fault. It's our fault because we're saying things like, it's fine if the government is totally neutral on religion. We'd prefer it. Well, God's not going to bless that.
yeah.
God's going to bless the people who, as mistaken as they are, think it's important to push forward Christian values.
Even if it were possible for the government to truly be neutral on religion,
It's
right,
not. It's
right,
impossible. And if it were possible, it'd be evil.
exactly. Yep. Yeah, good word, man.
That's my opinion.
John, George, anything to add in here on the tail end? Because I know we're rounding the bend of a longer episode, but this has been a fun conversation, and I was really looking forward to James weighing in on this latter part. But any closing thoughts, or anything we're leaving hanging?
Nope.
I'll just end with an open-ended question that nobody can fully answer, or maybe it's rhetorical.
I will absolutely answer your question. Go ahead.
Is it possible to see a Reformation in our day that's not political?
It's a pretty good question.
Amen.
Viewers and listeners, let us know your answer to John's question. No, if anybody's watching the channel, I would encourage you reach out and get in touch with us. Do we have? This is terrible. Do we have an email address, fellas? I can't remember.
We do somewhere.
I
Yeah.
We
think
have
it's
one somewhere.
wait, I think I know what it is, right? It's Covenant Matters
Yeah,
EM
gmail.com or something.
at gmail.com. Covenant Matters EM at
Oh, it's
gmail.com.
got EM on the end
Yeah.
because of our heritage. Um, okay, yeah. So maybe covenantmattersem at gmail.com. We'll figure that out later. We'll put it in the show notes. That'll be on Brandon. But reach out to us honestly if your thoughts on this episode or any future ones. I know we tend to try to do one of these little roundtables about once a month, and then we have teaching videos that are coming out throughout the month that we do individually. So love to hear from you. In fact, I've been reached out to several times already. Several of you have reached out. I've appreciated that. So thank you guys for that, and always looking for what's helpful. So in the meantime, we'll go ahead and wrap this one up. But John, George, and James, good to see you guys, and appreciate you hopping on today.